I wasn't sure if I was going to make a video for all of the Pride content that I made this month, but here we are. Hey there, I'm Bella Sims, and for the whole month of June, I've been working on brand new Pride custom content for The Sims 4. Now, I've pretty much exclusively been making these over on Twitch, which means that I've been streaming almost the entire process of each piece from start to finish, but it also means that 90% of the footage that I have is from stream, aside from a few things that I did off of stream, which isn't a lot. For the time being, I'm still not able to have a separate recording going for just my stream without all the overlays, while also having my stream running as my PC isn't quite that good, so I have to work with what I've got. That means that the footage may not be super crisp as I'm scaling it up to hide most of the extra stuff, as well as the fact that I couldn't download the first stream in HD for some reason. You'll see some of the emotes fly over screen and movement on the side behind me a bit, but I hope you can look past that at least for now. I'll try and sort something out for future videos. Like most of my previous videos, this is going to be me talking about the process of each piece, some thoughts, some tips, just whatever I think to talk about, really. It's not going to be a tutorial of sorts, but I hope you'll still learn something here and there. Day 1 started off very strong by me not knowing what I was going to do. The starting off strong part may have been a little bit exaggerated. I thought it would be a good idea to go through my Pinterest folder on a stream of all the Pride adjacent themed items that I have and do a vote, which was okay, but I have a small audience, so there wasn't too much variety in the responses, which is fine. I'm not trying to complain or talk down, but I think maybe I should have been a little bit more prepared with some ideas rather than relying on my audience to do the work for me. Regardless, we settled on what I've called the Pride Ribbon Garter tights. Bit of a mouthful, but how else am I supposed to explain what this is? Pretty much anything that is already rainbow themed that would easily convert to all the other Pride flags in some way, I saved to my Pinterest Pride board for later. The original inspiration for these was a rainbow cord ribbon material that was wrapped around the legs from a metal ring, and I saw that as being recolored in all the Pride flag varieties. In terms of the structure of the model and actually creating it, I started out with the idea of using a mesh extruded along the surface with face snapping and a shrink wrap modifier, because that's just the method that I go about creating a lot of my content. I eventually settled on using curves to get the shape as close as possible, following the shape of the legs. Also, pro tip, use Ctrl T to rotate individual curve points without messing up all the other points. If you know, you know. I did end up putting a shrink wrap modifier on it when converting it to a mesh, which gave me a better shape for the leg, but I did need to go through and fix up a few points here and there, all the way down the leg. And you know how I feel about details, so there's a tied off knot at the bottom too. This was a slight bit of an oversight for one reason. Well, kind of two reasons. So when making shoes for The Sims, the shoe mesh is actually including the foot up to a little bit above the ankle. When putting on high-heeled shoes, the shape of the foot actually changes, but this mesh has no way of knowing how it changes or how to change with it. Which isn't too bad, it still works to a degree, but best results are on flats or barefoot. The second reason is that with the tied off part at the back, again, there's no way for it to know what kind of shoe is being worn, so it will stick out the back depending on how thick the shoe is. Just something to keep in mind. It personally doesn't bother me too much, so hopefully it doesn't bother you too. When it comes to the unwrapping, I split the mesh into each section that I wanted to be a full section of rainbow, or each pride flag. Then I can overlay each section of the UV on top of each other, and it's probably worth noting that once I put the texture on, I thought that the flag colors were too spread out and wasn't as readable as a pride flag, so I cut each UV in half so that the flag repeated twice as much. Creating the texture doesn't look like too much, but I set up layers of equal portions across my templates, that way I can fill in each layer with alpha lock to be the colors I need for each flag. It's a bit of extra work to set up in the beginning, but it makes life a lot easier when I've got 50 odd additional swatches to color in. These garter tights actually have 52 swatches, and I won't be showing off the coloring of all of the swatches, I promise, because it gets repetitive, at least for me, let alone for people to watch. I did about half of the swatches, I think, on stream, then worked on finishing them off of stream. At this point, I was using a guide from Reddit that I've been using for a while in order to create all of my Pride content, but it isn't super conclusive. There's a lot on there that I didn't include, and for some types of content, I just can't include because of the flag design. And then there's also a small list of extras that I include from suggestions from Tumblr and TikTok and from Stream. So I'm following about 4 different lists for Pride flags to include, and for each Pride content piece that I make, the swatches that I include change from piece to piece, not intentionally, it's just what happens. A little bit later in the month, I made the effort to sit down and finally put together what I call my Pride master list. It includes a lot of the swatches from the Reddit guide, and I added in the ones that I wanted to from all of the other lists that I have. And so going forward, all the flags on my master list are included in my Pride content, with the exception of a few on the list that I may not be able to include due to the flag design. This is usually the demi-romantic, demisexual, agoromantic, agosexual, as the triangular design doesn't translate well sometimes, and the flags with symbols on them like polyamorous, sapphic, Achillean, and diamoric don't always work well either. Don't mind the fact that my monitor is actually 1200 by 1080, so the top gets cut off all the time, but here's what the final result looks like. So most of this project was completed on the 1st of June, with a little bit off stream working on the 2nd, totaling about 5 hours of work. Now we move on to day 3 for another stream. For the next project, I settled on the losing outcome from the vote last stream, which was based on this choker with a rainbow star charm with hearts around the neck. I started out with a cylinder and just adjusted it to fit the neck that is most certainly not perfectly cylindrical in shape. And then it's just making all of the individual components and then piecing them all together. Starting with the piece of hardware that the D-ring hangs from, and then making the D-ring itself. Changing the mesh to green here means absolutely nothing other than the fact that it makes it easier to see the mesh while I'm working on it. I opted for a not so symmetrical approach to make it more dynamic and natural looking, so the D-ring sits on a bit of an angle, which in turn means that the star charm is also rotated and off center. Did you know that stars are just cylinders with 10 points? I just scale in every second point and boom, there's a star. It helps to scale them on the shift Y axis, that way it only goes on the X and Z and not the Y axis, but I forgot to do that, no big deal, I just scale them back out. I also bevel the very pointy edges to make them seem a bit less pointy and more round and friend shaped. With the UV, I'm thinking a little bit ahead. I didn't want all of the hearts to share the same UV space, but instead in order as they appear from left to right, so that I can apply a gradient to them later. The star has the flag design as is, where you can see the individual color bars, but for the hearts this was a little bit harder, because there's 6 individual hearts, so it works for the rainbow flag that has 6 colors, but that's about it. And that's how we decided to do a gradient instead. It doesn't matter how many colors there are, and it produces some nice results for some of the flags where the colors merge together. On to texturing. The black choker band stays consistent throughout all of the swatches, as does the metal hardware, so these are textured as I want them to look. For the star and the heart, I add basic shading on a grey background so that I can add overlay layers of colour later in Photoshop. Because the star itself has a bit of a bulge to it to give it some dimension, it does mean that the UV map is a little bit warped. So if I was to add these straight flag lines in Photoshop to the 2D texture, they would appear warped and wavy on the 3D model. And then the opposite, when drawing a straight line on the 3D model, it produces warped and wavy results on the 2D texture. So for each flag type, the 3 colors flag, 4 color flag, 5 color, 6 color, 7 color, I create a template for each one using just red lines in Blender to then transfer into Photoshop and then trace over them. Now for this project, I'm not going to show the entire recoloring process of all 36 swatches that the choker has. To start with, I go about recoloring the hard way, by tracing the lines for each flag as I do them. When I got to the lesbian flag though, that smart little part of my brain takes over with a new workflow that drastically improves the time spent on recoloring, and I use this in most of the future projects, and I'll try my best to explain. I'm still using my red guidelines that I do in Blender as a guide and an overlay layer for the color. I trace out the second stripe downwards and color on a new layer. Think of it as a way of saving the selection on a new layer to use later. Then trace the third stripe down on a new layer, the fourth stripe down on a new layer, fifth stripe, etc. I don't ever have these layers unhidden, but I can just select the pixels for each layer and then go back to my overlay layer and fill in the color for the flag. And then select the next layer mask, fill in the color, select the next one, fill in the color. Like I said, setting it up this way takes a little bit longer in the beginning, but this saves so much time in the long run. I still didn't get all of the swatches done on stream though, so this carried over to the stream the next day, and this is when we also worked on all of the other stuff to get it into the game, like the weight painting and converting it to masculine framed sims as well. All in all, I spent about 5.5 hours working on this choker. And here's just showing off how all of the swatches look like in Creator Sim. On to day 8, and this was a catch-up day because I had missed a few days of streaming. I did intend to stream most days of June, though not every day because I knew that was going to be too much of a commitment for me. I wasn't sure what to actually work on today, and chat suggested some horns. I've made quite a few fantasy horns in my time, so this time I wanted to go for something a little bit more cute and round, not obviously very realistic, but something that you could find being made by someone IRL. The mesh was very easy and quick to do, and just like with the choker, I did the basic style of shading on a grey base, and then made some guidelines for all of the different number of striped flags. Then I used these guides to create masks in Photoshop on different layers for all the colours. Again, I'm not going to show the creation of absolutely every swatch because that's going to get old real quick, but here's just a couple so that you can see how the selecting of the masks and the colouring works. Maybe. The end result is really cute, and I had the suggestion to also put it in the skin detail section. It seems like an odd request, but this means that they stay a part of your Sim's genetics when changing outfits, and you don't have to apply it for each one. So if you apply it to an everyday outfit and you then want to make a formal outfit, the horns will stay there. The other cool thing is that it works alongside what's called a hat slider, so that you can adjust and rotate and move the horns to suit any hairstyle you could dream of, really. This is also a project where I put together that Pride Flag master list, so while I couldn't include all 59 for this one, I did manage to fit 52 of them in. The time I recorded for the horns is 4 hours and 14 minutes, and it's the first project that I started and finished all in one stream. Now we are on to day 9, and I'm trying something a little bit different today. Where the past projects have been an object usually based on something rainbows, that way it's easy to translate to other flag designs, this is a rainbow flower crown that is going to have just one swatch as kind of an umbrella for Pride. It would definitely be possible to recolor the different flowers to fit other flags, but this was the vision for the project, and recoloring these in other colors would be significantly more involved than the previous items and take a significant amount of time longer to do all 50 of them. Again, I'm also one for the details and accuracy, so these flowers have been made to be the color that they are, and recoloring them in unrealistic colors isn't something that I'm interested in doing. But my content is always open to recoloring. I have the specific details in the terms of use page when downloading my content, so if anyone wants to have a crack at it, you're more than welcome to. For the flowers themselves, I started off with grabbing a sunflower that I've actually already made for a sunflower crown last year. Sunflowers are my favorite flower, so I really wanted to include one. Then I and the viewers in chat were talking about our favorite flowers, and I took some of those that fit within the color scheme and created those. I'm trying to keep them as low poly as possible, but with so many individual pieces that isn't entirely possible. Also, because there are going to be so many pieces, I'm trying to overlap as many UV pieces as possible to give the most amount of texture space to each piece. The iris was the first flower that I made, apart from the sunflower, And after that, I decided to go in color order so that way I can start figuring out what I need to do next, how many flowers I need, etc. For the red flower, we decided on poppies. And because they are a small-ish flower, I put a couple of them in to fill out the space a little bit. I do want this to be a full looking crown from the front. Then for the orange flower, we voted on a tiger lily. This one probably ended up being my favorite flower in here. Not sure why, but I just really like the texture detail of it and the color, it's just really nice. We've already got yellow, so for green I went for something that's not actually a flower, but still the same kind of vibe. I thought about doing a succulent, but with the thicker leaves I thought it might stand out too much and not look like it belonged with all the rest of the flowers. There is a specific type of succulent called an aeonium that has long thin leaves and I thought it would fit in quite nicely. Fun fact, I actually had one of these IRL until the local possums came in and decided it was a tasty midnight snack. There is none of it left now and it's long dead, along with all of my other succulents, but let's move right along. While making the succulent, I actually discovered something on accident. Rather than duplicating a leaf with Shift D, then R to rotate each time, I could do that for the first one, but then Shift R will take that rotation and automatically duplicate and rotate it to the same degree. Then I'll just duplicate a leaf for the next layer up, move it a bit, and then quickly duplicate all the leaves for that layer. Oh, and another thing, before duplicating something like 100 times like I did, make sure to unwrap the very first one, especially if you want them all to share the same UV. Trust me, it saves a lot of time, and once you make the mistake once, you will never make it again. Now, I already have one blue flower, the iris, but I think I'm going to make it a little bit more purple instead. And so I want to make more of a transition, and I go for this blue variety of pansy. I feel like when blue pansy comes to mind, I at least think of the blue pansy from Animal Crossing, but that isn't very realistic. So this was the best blue one that I could find, and I do actually like the softer look to it. Now that I'm piecing together the crown as I go, I figured it needed another blue flower to fill it in a little bit. I went for bluebells as I can also add some height with it too. Because I know I'm going to be duplicating the flower a few times, I still try to keep the poly count as low as I possibly can. They're just so dainty and cute and I really like them. I couldn't just leave it here though, it's a bit bare at the end, so I need to put in a pink flower as well, even though pink isn't on the traditional rainbow flag. These are begonia flowers, another small and dainty flower. I'm more of a foliage begonia person, but the flowers are still quite nice. As you can imagine by now, this was quite a large project. I spent a lot of time on day 9 putting together the base mesh for all of them, which meant all of the texturing and finishing up the package was left to the next stream on the 13th. First order of business, coming back to it after a break, I felt it needed a little bit more filling out, but I didn't want to add in more flowers at this point. No, this flower crown needed some leaves to fill in the gaps. Again, because of the texture space, all the leaves are the same texture and based on the leaves of a begonia to tie it back in and make it make sense. So part of the reason why the poly count gets up there a bit is that all of these petals and leaves that are just made of planes are one-sided and they need to be duplicated with their faces flipped so that they can be seen from both sides in the game. So not every single face is duplicated twice, but a lot of them are, so it very easily almost doubles the poly count. Just like with the horns, this flower crown is hooked into a hat slider so that you can use the slider for the neck and adjust it and have greater control over the size and shape of the crown itself. It's not required for it to work, it will still show up in game, but you just don't get the fine-tuning functionality to it, and I really advise it. If you are a CC creator, consider looking into how to make your hats work with the slider because it's super easy and takes an extra 5, maybe 10 seconds. Not even joking. Oh, and I almost forgot, the final recorded time for this one was just over 5 hours. In regards to the time spent on each project, I use that term lightly. That isn't the time spent on stream on each project. I've basically been tracking my time spent on projects since the beginning of 2021. mostly as a curiosity thing, but also as a way to keep me on track and being productive, and it also helps when quoting for commissions. When it comes to streaming though, it wasn't quite a true indication of the time actively spent working on each project because there's times where I get distracted, I take breaks, and just in general, the time spent pausing and talking to chat every 10 seconds. So, depending on the stream and depending on the project, I take off like an hour or two depending on how productive I feel I was during that stream. It also helps that after the past year and a half of making content, I have a pretty good idea of how long something would take me to make. Next up, we're taking inspiration from the choker earlier in the month and making a matching set of earrings. I would have made these sooner, but I spent a couple days thinking about the layout and what the earrings would actually look like. I knew I wanted to have both the star and the heart featured, and I landed on an asymmetrical design with the chain, kind of like what my VTuber has. The texture itself was already halfway done. I just had to transfer over all of the textures I had already made for the choker and adjust them into the new texture space for the earrings. The heart on the choker had a gradient across 6 different hearts, which isn't very applicable for this design. So I just put the flag onto the heart as well, and was lucky enough that the lines weren't warped, so it was easy peasy. Again, I'm not going to show the entire process of recoloring, but these earrings also have 36 swatches to match the choker, and the hardware is all in silver too. It would have been too much to make it available in gold as well, let alone all of the other metal colors that I would normally do for custom content. This was quite a simple and easy project to break up the more complex projects that I've been working on lately, with 2.5 clocked hours for this. On to day 15. I started out with an idea for another set of earrings as a suggestion from one of my viewers and a really good friend of mine. They suggested some pride flag plugs. I messed around with it a little bit, but I couldn't get it to work out in the way that I wanted to in my head, so I didn't get very far before scrapping it. So then I was very lost on what I was going to do today, and I got another suggestion to do a teddy bear with pride flag ears and tummy. I think because of the previous failure, I wasn't exactly feeling it and wasn't trusting the process very much as soon as it didn't look great. But I stuck with it, and I am glad that I did because this ended up being one of my favorite creations for the entire month. I didn't actually know until after the first stream when someone pointed out to me, but there's actually a bear that's similar to this in the base game. I say it's similar, it's a bear holding a heart, but I do have to say I'm pretty sure mine is a lot cuter. Anyway, I started off with a really rough blocked out shapes using cubes with a subdivision modifier. I found a really cute plush teddy bear that I was using as a reference to recreate, mostly for the proportions because I feel like that's a very important part of a cute teddy bear. When I was putting the arms into place, someone suggested that I should point them upwards so that it looks like he is giving a hug. I liked that idea, but I immediately thought, what if he was hugging a heart like one of my Twitch emotes? You've probably seen it by now flying across screen, but that's how that idea evolved. Now that there is a big heart in the way, you can't actually see the belly of the bear, so what I'll do instead is put the pride flag on the heart, and I'm also going to skip the pride flag on the ears as the heart is now a thing on its own and I feel it's more like contained that way. As for the mesh itself, I didn't want to keep it all as those separated pieces because then you see that they are separated pieces. That sounds really stupid to say, but you see where the pieces intersect and they join together, that kind of thing. So I kept the heart separate, of course, the head and the body separate, but the ears I extruded out from the head and the arms and legs I extruded out from the body. This just makes it more seamless and a clean join between the two, and ultimately more optimized as there's a lot less unnecessary hidden polygons. Because I already had the shape of the arms and the legs that I wanted when I blocked it out, I extruded out from the body the polygons that I would use, and then used face snapping to follow the shape of the reference arms. For the texturing, I started out with basic shading, but I wanted to make them look really fluffy, so I also added a fur texture over the top. I found it kind of hard to make the fur texture look good, so it's honestly not as great as I pictured in my head, but I still think it gives a good texture to it. I basically just tried to follow the different loops or rings of fur around the body in a lighter wave, and then a darker wave, and then a lighter wave, etc. And I also add in some seams for some extra realism and something to break up that monotony. But I think you get the point, so I'm just going to cut the rest of the texturing for the bear. It's just the same over and over again of drawing lines for fur. For the heart, there is a base swatch of the pinky red for those that may not want to use a pride option. That plus the other 59 pride flags comes to 60 swatches in total. I did the technique as in the past where I make my guidelines for the lines of all the flags, and then in Photoshop I trace out those sections onto different layers to use as masks to then add the color over the grey swatch. The final time recorded for making the bear is 5 hours and 20 minutes. I don't have much else to talk about for the bear except this one last little thing while I show off all of the swatches. I got a random comment on one of the TikToks where I showed off some of the creation of the bear, asking if it was something that could be given as a gift. I was a little confused as I had no idea that this kind of thing existed in the game. Bear in mind, nowadays, I don't really play the game, I just make sims and create a sim and make custom content. But apparently, if you are able to have an item in your inventory, you can give it as a gift to another sim under the friendly interactions. The bear that I cloned this from was a large static item, so I had to go in and change some things to be able to do that, but I think it was very worth it in the end, and it's just a cute little extra interaction you can do with it. Moving on to the 21st of June, and nearing the end of the month, I put out 3 options to vote on today. The first one was worm on a string, make them earrings, and make them pride. Option number 2 was the winning option, which was mushrooms, make them pride themed, and make them garden lights. And the third option was to make a pride froggy plush, which I think was a close second. But mainly because I had just finished the teddy bear plush, I was kind of glad it didn't win. I wanted to work on something new. I started out with a familiar method of using a cube with a subdivision modifier to give me some added detail. I blocked out the shape knowing I wouldn't be able to get it exact, but it was enough for me to work with. I applied the modifier pretty early on so that way I can fine-tune the shape. The original idea was to have 3 different mushroom shapes, each sharing the same texture, so that it wouldn't be too heavy on the workload. When starting the texture for the toadstool, I very quickly realized a flaw in my plan. The spots are very unique to this type of mushroom, and the second mushroom that I wanted to do, the ink cap, would have a completely different texture. So realizing that I would have 2 textures to work with and would be double the work than I initially thought, I ended up just sticking with the 2 different types, the toadstool and the ink cap. The ink cap starts out with the same method to build up the base. For the drippy ink parts, I extrude out just a single edge down and form the shape of the drip. Then, once the whole perimeter is done, I separate it out and add a solidify modifier to give it thickness, then join it back up with the base mesh. It was a bit too harsh and flat for my liking, so I added in an edge loop around and expanded that out to round out the drips. The blue and red that you see while I was unwrapping is just an overlay that I put on and forgot to take off. It just shows the orientation of the faces. Anything that is red is basically facing away from you and therefore won't be seen in game when from that angle because faces are one-sided. There are a few faces that I had to fix up here and there, and then I just forgot to turn it off because it wasn't distracting to my brain, so I just didn't notice anything was up. I'm also doing a lot of explaining while I'm unwrapping, especially for the ink cap, talking about why I'm making the cuts and where and showing the evolution of them. I section out the top part first and the underside ring because that's the easy part. The stalk is just unwrapped like a cube because it was made from a cube to start with. I hide all that so it's not distracting while I do the rest. I split the remaining ring of drips into front and back basically, and then end up splitting each individual drip into its own section by marking a seam between each one. But I'm not quite done there, and this is one of the main things that I was explaining. The faces around the curved part would ideally have splits around them too, so that way the faces aren't so stretched out on the UV. It probably doesn't matter too much on this scale, but I did it anyways for a cleaner look. And then it's just a game of Tetris to fit all of those pieces together. One of the best ideas that I had in order to make my life easier was to make the spots on a different texture image. That way later, when I put it into Photoshop, though at this point I can start saying Clip Studio Paint because I finally bought it to start transitioning away from Adobe. But later, when I put the pride flag texture onto the mushroom base, I can have the spots on a separate layer on top so that way they aren't affected and I don't have to mask them out manually. Even with symmetry on, it was quite the task to create all the individual spots, so I'll spare you some of the details. This was pretty much just the same process for the ink cap too. I created the base texture that would be affected by the pride flag colors onto one image texture and the white scales on a new image. There was a bit of cleanup work in Clip Studio Paint, mainly to separate out the cream stalk part that wouldn't be affected by the gradient and change the base to a light grey. Originally, I was going to just do standard circular rings for the colors of the pride flags, but this ended up being way too harsh and instead decided on doing a gradient instead. The colors are so much softer and I could just go between the two textures for one gradient, then do the next gradient, do both textures, make the third gradient, do both textures, etc. I've also made a new folder within Clip Studio to store all of the pride gradients as I made them, so for future projects it'll be easy to use the pride gradients again. It was going to be a little while before I could stream again, and I wanted to still be making progress as it was getting towards the end of the month. I didn't get all of the swatches done on stream, so now entering the off-stream footage. When it comes to making these work as actual lights, that's where vertex paint comes in. I was probably a little too thorough with this and didn't have to do quite as much work. How it works is basically anything white will be brightly lit, and anything that is black won't emit light. So I kind of visualize it and imagine as this being a black object. In the dark, when lit, how do I want the object to look like? Where do I want the light to be coming from, and the fall off from the light of that? I blocked out the colors, but then I ended up smoothing the vertex paints anyway, so I could have blocked it out a bit rougher, I think, and not spend so much time on it, but oh well. Now all there is left to do is the LEDs and putting all of my models and textures into the package file, which takes a while when you have so many texture files. I spent just shy of 6 hours working on these, and it seems pretty accurate because it's pretty much 2 separate objects in one set. The next project, I intended to start off stream just to get it going and then finish it on stream, but I was just in the groove and completely finished it off stream. I revisited the idea of the pride plug earrings. In my mind, this manifested into tunnels for stretched ears, but put weights hanging from the tunnels as pride flags. Here's a small little sketch that I did because I felt like I wasn't quite getting the idea across when I was trying to explain it. Originally, why the idea wasn't working is because I wanted to be able to hide the ears that come with a sim, so that way when putting on these modified ears, there wouldn't be a duplicate. That wasn't exactly possible, and since I don't have Eco Living, I don't have access to the plugs that came with that pack to dissect and see how they work. They probably wouldn't even work with the base game because the ability to change the ear shape for the stretched ears are probably coded into the plugs themselves, which require the pack. So I was explaining this to my friend who was the one that originally gave me the idea, and they convinced me that it doesn't even matter. There's mods to hide the ears, or even just making the ear small and hide it within the fake ear would be fine too, and you won't see it behind these ones. So in the end, the earring is actually a modified ear shape, plus the earring itself. There isn't as much flexibility as I originally hoped, but it still works. And now that I'm looking at it as well, I kind of messed up the proportions a bit, and it looks like there's a lot of extra skin on the bottom of the ear rather than the earlobe itself being stretched out. So now I'm a little bit tempted to go in and fix that up and be more like I envisioned, but I also make no promises. I'm using the same method that I used previously and the method that I always use when making my chains. I start off with a low poly torus, give it a bit of an elongated shape because personally I just like oval links rather than circular ones. I unwrap it first before duplicating it, and then I duplicate it up, rotate a bit, then duplicate it again, and rotate it the opposite way. I could just leave it as 2 links, rotated 90 degrees, but this always just feels less natural and just odd to me. This way, there's 3 different rotations and it isn't just 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 0 degrees, 90 degrees. You get what I'm trying to say, I hope. Now that I've got a small section to work with, I can just chuck an array modifier on it to make it repeat however many times that I need, and then a curve modifier to follow a simple Bezier curve that I made. Everything that is part of the piercing itself, I can put into the UV texture space of earrings, and the ear itself, including the extra stretch part that I made, will follow the standard skin texture, so it doesn't matter what skin color your sim has, it will pick it up. Because the pride part of this is the flag itself, that means I was able to include all 59 flags from my pride master list. And because I was working on these off stream with little distractions other than whatever YouTube videos I was watching, it's a very accurate and realistic time of 2 hours and 16 minutes for these. Since I finished them off stream, I wanted to squeeze in one final project for stream on the very last day of June. Remember that day when I put out a vote for 3 different ideas and one of them was worm on a string pride earrings? Well, people really seemed to like that idea too. So I went ahead and I made them. I wasn't 100% sure how I would go about making them, so I started making them off stream. I could make them with transparency with different layers for fur, but The Sims doesn't always take too kindly to overlapping transparent textures. So I figured I would go with a more Maxis match approach. I started out with a tube of the basic shape, and yes, I could have left it as is for that really simple look, but I still wanted them to look fuzzy and soft. So each of the faces I extruded out and merged all of the points to the center to form little spikes. From a distance, I think there's enough of them to make them look soft and fuzzy. I spent all of 30 minutes putting together the base to see if my idea would work before realizing, yes, it was working, and I was making way too much progress and I should save it for stream later that night. The extruding and merging was quite a process, but it was something really easy to just put on autopilot and zone out. I did just a very simple unwrapping for the worm, just a line down the back. I had to reorganize the UVs a little bit as the nose part took up a lot of space and by the time it got to the tail, it wasn't even a pixel. So I just evened out the rows a little bit, and when I put a gradient on, first of all, good one for me saving all of those gradients when I made the mushrooms. Secondly, the color distribution wasn't very even, so I just shuffled the UV around some more. The seam at the back was pretty good, but it could be better. So I move around the edge vertices until they line up a bit better with the gradient. All that's left to do is go through and use all of those gradients to make all 50 Pride swatches. And so, we are finally at the conclusion of Pride Month. I managed to get 9 different creations done, which was quite a decent amount, I think. For those that skipped to the end, here's a quick recap of what I've made. First up, we've got the Pride Ribbon Garter tights, a Pride Star choker with a matching set of earrings, Pride horns, a rainbow flower crown, a Pride teddy bear, which I think may be my favorite thing from this month, mushroom garden lights, stretch ear tunnel weights, and finally, worm on a string earrings. I'm always trying to do new and unique things, especially when it comes to Pride, rather than cliche or tacky things, so I hope you enjoy. Everything is posted to Tumblr for download, and there's always a link down below, and I'll see you for the next video.